My name is Patty Bernard, and I am a member of the Nevada Women's History Project. Today we are interviewing Dana Bennett, Nevada historian. This interview is being brought to you through the generosity of the Estelle J. Kelsey Foundation, and today is Sunday, December 3rd, 2023. Thank you for interviewing with us, Dana. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Patty. I'm Dana Bennett. I was born August 20th, 1962 in Seward, Nebraska. My folks came to Nevada in the summer of 1963 when I was about 9 months old. When my folks first moved here, I'm the oldest of three girls, and my two sisters were both born in Reno, but we first lived in a duplex over in the Alphabet Streets in Sparks. And then Mom and Dad found a place on Lander and rented that for a little while until they could buy a house on Gordon. And so we all grew up on Gordon Avenue in a house that Mom and Dad could afford, which is kind of funny when you think about that neighborhood now. It was not a great neighborhood then, and the house was a smoking deal. So that's where we grew up. I walked to Mount Rose Elementary for school, for elementary. I walked to B.D. Billinghurst until they decided to tear it down, and then had to be bused to Swope for a year. And then walked to Reno High School unless I could take my mom's car, which wasn't very often. Growing up on Gordon Avenue, it was a historic neighborhood, and I became cognizant that the people around me, around the neighborhood, were people who had been an integral part of Reno's society. So there was a former gambler who lived next door and a pharmacist who lived across the street. But my dad worked downtown at Harold's Club. He worked for Jesse Beck, and then later worked for Woodburn Wedge. Mr. Woodburn lived around the corner. And I would walk downtown to meet my dad. We'd have lunch, then we'd walk home together, and he would tell me stories about Reno as we walked along. So when you think about going from downtown Reno to the Old Southwest, we passed the McCarran Mansion, we passed Nixon, we passed the house where Jack Dempsey used to stay when he was here. And Dad would tell me all these stories, and I was fascinated by them. When I was about 7, we started going to Midas out in Elko County once a year, every year. Mom and Dad would take us out of school for a week, and we'd go out and camp for a week and run through the sagebrush and just have a great time. So thinking about some of the teachers that I had, that also influenced my interest in history. When I was at Swope, my American history teacher was Mr. Harris, and I thought he was marvelous. And Mr. Young was the director of the Nevada History Club. It seems to me like we went on field trips or something, but that was, Mom and Dad were always taking us out. We were always on the weekends going out to Hooten Wells, or going to look for other Pony Express stations, or going to Winnemucca Lake, or going to Virginia City, or going to all of these different places. That was my dad's idea of a good time, and I thought it was a great time as well. When I was at Reno High, I had teachers that definitely shaped my future, and not necessarily in history, but in writing. So I had marvelous English teachers. Mel Shields was the greatest English teacher ever. Margaret Muth was a legendary English teacher, and I had her sort of at the end of her career, but she was still just a marvelous teacher. Laverne Forrest was the yearbook director. They were fabulous teachers. I was fortunate to be at Reno High when I was. There was no question in my family. You went to college after high school. There was no debate about that. But I didn't want to go to UNR, and I didn't want to go to Las Vegas. So I arbitrarily picked Boise State because it was close to Midas. I would be able to get to family functions. By then, my parents owned a place there, and we were spending a lot more time. But I received several scholarships when I left Reno High. It's amazing how clearly I still remember this, even though it was a couple of years ago. The Reno Elks Most Valuable Girls Scholarship, the last year of the Fleischman Scholarship. I did not get the John Esquagas Scholarship, however. My friend Margaret got that scholarship, and she definitely earned it. So I went to Boise State to become a dentist. And my dad said, I wanted to study history, and he said, don't study history. Major in something where you can make a lot of money, and then you can do history on the side. Like, looked around, I liked our dentist. We had a marvelous dentist. So I thought, well, I'll just become a dentist. And I got to organic chemistry in my freshman year and didn't do so well. So I took a semester to explore all the classes I was interested in. I took philosophy, I took economics, I took history, a couple of other courses. And then I called my dad and my mom and said, well, I'm changing my major to history. And Dad said, well, that's dumb, you'll never make any money. And I said, well, I noticed you're not paying for my education. I am. I have scholarships, I have a job, so I'm going to study history. And that was that.
And then you went on from Boise. Was it important for you to get advanced degrees? Did you think that far ahead?
By the time I was a junior at Boise State, I had a professor named Phoebe Lundy, and I needed to make up some credits during the summer in order to graduate on time. So she offered 2 courses one summer. One was the history of women, and the other was the history of witchcraft. And these were groundbreaking, had never been offered before classes, and I loved every minute I was in those classes, every single second. And so I started to become interested in women's history, which at that time it was a brand new field. It was, there was a debate. Is that a legitimate study of history? And as I was getting ready for graduation, Phoebe convinced me, and my advisor, Bob Sims, who was an amazing professor, both convinced me that I could go on to graduate school and I should think about a PhD in history. So I applied to 5 different schools. 2 of them accepted me. One was Rutgers with a full ride, and one was the State University of New York at Binghamton for a full ride. And I knew a professor at Binghamton, and so I chose Binghamton. I had never been east of Nebraska. I had no idea what the world looked like over there, but I thought, well, what the heck, let's go try out the East Coast.
Why was it important for you to seek out the East Coast and not the universities in the West?
Well, for one, none of the universities in the West offered women's history degrees as a graduate program. None of them. There were just a handful of programs in the entire country at the time. And this is 1984. Feels like it wasn't that long ago, but it was kind of the dark ages when it comes to women's history. And that was when Gerda Lerner was becoming so prominent at Wisconsin. And the professor that I worked with at Binghamton, Sarah Elbert, she had studied at Cornell. She was known as a scholar of Laura Ingalls Wilder. But really, I looked at it as an opportunity to go try a different part of the country that I had never seen before. And obviously had never lived there, so I thought I'd just try it. There weren't any universities in the West at the time that offered that program. So I went to go get a PhD in women's history. I kind of failed.
And were there any folks there that opened your eyes to things that you had not been aware of as a woman?
I hated the East. I hated trees. The sun never came out. I mean, for a Nevada girl, it was the most miserable place to live ever. And all of my classmates were from the East Coast, from New Jersey and New York, and for me, it was like being in a foreign country. I think I got an excellent education at Boise State, but I really struggled with the graduate program at SUNY. And I was sitting in the graduate lounge one day, and a guy had just finished his, I think he was ABD, he was starting to work on his he just finished his dissertation, and he'd gotten a job offer, and he was super excited. He was going to go to Michigan for $14,000 a year. And I had 2 thoughts. There's no sunshine in Michigan, and that's all? So I took a master's in passing and came home. I had to come back to the West.
And when you came back, you had to make a living.
Yep. So when I was in Binghamton, the summer between the semesters, I took a summer job with Manpower. Remember Manpower?
I do.
Passed the typing test, you know, all of that stuff, and bought a couple of cheap suits and some pantyhose, and they were sending me out as a secretary to different places. And one of the places I worked at the most was called Foundation Health Plan, and HMOs were very new at the time. This was a health maintenance organization. So I get back to Reno, and looking in the newspaper and classifieds trying to find a job. Nobody advertises for historian. I was teaching at Truckee Meadows as an adjunct. I taught Nevada history and U.S. history. I'm a miserable teacher. I feel so bad for those students. They should have had a better instructor. So I knew teaching wasn't my option. And I saw a job posted for Health Plan in Nevada. It was brand new in the area. And the salary was enough that I could get my own apartment. So I went and applied and went to work for them.
And then?
So I was at a Christmas party. I think I'd been home maybe I'd only been home a couple weeks, maybe I'd been home a year, I don't know. And I was talking with a friend who was also getting his master's in history. And I said, what do we do with these dumb degrees? And he said, well, you go work for the Legislative Council Bureau, which I'd never heard of. So I checked it out, and the research division hired people with master's degrees. And so I applied, and it took 3 years to get in. It took a while to get, I don't even think I had an initial interview. I think when I finally interviewed, I was hired for a part-time, or not part-time, for a temporary job. But it took a long time to even get the interview. So they interviewed me in November of 1988, and I went to work there in December 1988.
And what were some of your duties?
So I was hired to write bill summaries. That was it. Just as each bill was passed, because legislators read a statement on the floor when a bill is up for consideration on third reading. And the research division wrote those statements. So I had to summarize bills, and I did that pretty well. So they assigned me to a committee. One of the other researchers needed some help with the committee that he was working on. So about halfway through the session, I was assigned to Assembly Education. I had been assigned to the Assembly Committee on Economic Development, Small Business, and Tourism, which met fewer times than there are words in that name, which I thought was funny. But the job was supposed to end at the end of session, and there was no guarantee that it was permanent, because it depended on the budget and all of that. But by June of 1989, as the session was winding down, they always ended, well, they ended before July 4th in those years. I was offered a job as a full-time permanent research analyst.
You now have a permanent job with permanent income, a little bit more than what you had before. How did that job open up opportunities for you?
So that job was the best match for a history major, at least this history major. I knew I didn't want to teach, and everybody thinks still that people who study history want to teach, and that's not the only path with a history degree. I wanted to look stuff up and write it down. And as a friend later told me that I needed to edit that and say, I wanted to look stuff up, write it down, and tell you what it meant. And the research division provided that opportunity because the primary purpose of the research division was, I can't speak for it now, but then it was to answer questions that legislators had. So there were 63 legislators. This was their research arm. They could call and ask any question they wanted, and we would find an answer for them. And I was assigned a whole range of questions to answer. And then along with that, there were studies that we were assigned to. We were assigned to interim studies as well as what were called background papers. And the first background paper that I was assigned was on surrogate parenting. And I worked with Renee Diamond, Assemblywoman Renee Diamond from Las Vegas. I think that was her bill. I have to double check the year, but I'm pretty sure it was her bill. And wrote this background paper on what policy considerations were involved in the topic of surrogate parenting. Because there were other really interesting women in the legislature, like Senator Sue Wagner, Assemblywoman Jan Evans. There were a lot of questions that came in about women and women's issues, and they were usually assigned to me because I was the only woman on the staff, the only woman researcher on the staff. So I was assigned the memo that I still can't find for you, and I know I did it on sole traders that I did for Senator Wagner, which fascinated me because I'd never heard of such a thing. It never crossed my mind.
I'm still going to do it.
I know that women had to ask permission from their husband or a judge in order to open a business. And that just blew my mind. So there were, these really interesting women legislators who asked interesting questions. And then my own curiosity, I got to wondering about the women who had served in the legislature before the by then we're into the 1990s. And then along with that, because now looking back, I can see how this affected the trajectory of my very weird career. I was assigned to the Legislative Committee on Public Lands, which was chaired by Senator Dean Rhodes. And that committee was focused on public lands policy, but along with that are all of the multiple use of public lands, ranching, of course, and mining. So I started to become a lot more familiar with mining policy, which comes into play many years later. But the research division was it was a great place to work, really fun topics. One of the more interesting memos that I worked on was how to understand the cost to the state if abortion were not available. And that was fascinating to kind of puzzle through what the economic impact might be if that was not available. That must have been around the time of the ballot question. When was that? 1990?
Somewhere there.
Somewhere in there, yeah. The referendum.
Yeah. And what did you find? How did
It'd
you
be
conclude
expensive.
that?
There's a cost. If you have more people, there's going to be costs. And potentially they are more productive people who are contributing to the economy by working and so forth, but maybe they're not. So.
And did you work with some of the legislators on that?
The legislator who asked me to do that was from Las Vegas, and I don't know that he ever did anything with it, but it was a really interesting exercise. And while I say it rather flippantly, yes, it would be more expensive, but the reality was it was a very complicated question because you'd start, it was like an onion, you'd peel this thing back and you'd say, well, gosh, then you got to consider this and you got to consider that. And I found that fascinating. And so many of the questions we were asked, the legislator may have thought it was a simple question, but as you started peeling it away, all of them were complicated, complex questions. That was fun.
Who did you see that you felt in the legislature were leaders in women's movement issues?
At that time, the obvious answer is Sue Wagner, Jan Evans, Renee Diamond, essentially the women who were getting elected to the legislature were groundbreaking women. They were women who were active in all sorts of areas of different kinds of parts of Nevada and different activities in Nevada. I was very close with, and still am, with Barbara Vukanovich's granddaughter. And at the time, Barbara was our only congresswoman, our only Congress representative for all of Nevada. Was she the only one or just Northern Nevada at the time? I can't remember if we only had one or we had two. But
One.
no, we had two because that's how she got elected.
Oh, right.
They created the new seat.
New seat.
Yep, that's how she got elected. So there were women breaking ground, it seemed like constantly, in the late 80s, early 90s. Another woman who had a tremendous impact on me, a legislator, was Jean Ford. And Jean was, she may have been like in her last term, or maybe she had already gone to the university. This would be the early 90s. I vividly remember getting a phone call from her and saying, what do you think about starting a women's history project? I said, that'd be fabulous. Whatever I can do to help, let me know. I think that would be amazing. And as you know, nobody could get things done like Jean Ford. And I was so fortunate to know her, even though it was for such a short period of time, because she wasn't, I don't know if she, when was she diagnosed with cancer? Was it 97?
It was fairly quickly. It was about 97.
About 97? Yeah. And it's funny, I didn't have many conversations with Jean, but they all stick in my head. They're all vivid. I can hear her voice on the phone in my head.
And I remember that you were very interested in the suffrage movement and did some work.
Actually, I wasn't really. I was interested in the women who served in the legislature. And again, back to the onion, you start answering questions and you find out different things. And I thought there wasn't anything else to talk about with suffrage. Women in Nevada got the vote in 2014 ahead of the rest of the country, and then the vote in 2020. But what I discovered as I was looking at the women in office was just because women had the right to vote didn't mean they had the right to run for office. So in other states, it was a two-step process. In Nevada, it came with that winning the right to vote. I also, my complete bias as a woman was, of course, suffrage would have passed. I'm sure it took a while, but of course it would pass. But now we know it was a long, protracted battle. I mean, it was Jean who discovered that it first passed in 1869 and didn't quite make it over that second hump in 1871. So it was a very long process. And the last article that I wrote for the Historical Quarterly in 2020 was about the women who opposed suffrage. So then that all became interesting because there was really interesting stories there. But in the mid-late 1990s, I thought there wasn't much of a story left to tell. We already know that part, so let's go look at other things. But as it turned out, there was a really good story to tell.
So you were fairly young for ERA at that time, but that then reflected back to what you were doing. How did you then, at this point, reflect back on ERA?
So I remember watching what had happened with ERA when I was in high school. And I remember the two women that came to our government class to debate the pros and cons of the ERA. I cannot tell you who came to the class to speak in favor of the ERA, except that she clearly did not make an impression on me. The woman who came to class, and I was not debating, I knew which way I was leaning. I was leaning in favor of the ERA. But the woman who came to class to speak against the ERA was Janine Hansen, who I got to know later as a lobbyist, who was a very persuasive speaker and a winner of the Nugget Scholarship when she was in high school, the John Esquaga Scholarship. And I remember being in high school thinking, wow, she's making some good points. This is kind of interesting. But there's no doubt that the debate over the ERA, whether it passed or not, but the debate itself, the activities of women legislators like Jean Ford and like Barbara Vukanovich broke ceilings for me and for women my age and the women that came after us. At one point, I was told that it's a good thing I worked out at the LCB because they might not have hired another woman if I hadn't. Like it's all on me. But
did you see the association between the arguments in suffrage and the arguments that are so similar in equal rights?
I do now, but I didn't then. When did we start working, really digging deeply into suffrage? That wasn't until we were getting close to the centennial.
Right.
Yeah. And then you could really see those arguments. And then looking at the women who opposed suffrage and the arguments that they used were very similar to the women who opposed ERA. Very similar arguments. But a lot of the women who opposed suffrage were actually very politically astute, and then they'd become active in politics. And so you can see a slight thread from the women who opposed suffrage to women who were conservative office holders or activists or lobbyists, and then opposed ERA in the 70s and 80s. The 1995 session, which was the split session, I was starting to get a little antsy, I guess, for lack of a better word. LCB was a great place to work. And as I said, I worked with wonderful people and I really loved my job. But I got to thinking about maybe I wanted to try something different. And decided that the 1997 session would be my last session as a staff person. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but I wanted to start looking for something else. And during the 97 session, a couple of lobbyists came to me and said, you know, if you want to leave LCB, we'll share some of our clients with you if you will do the background work that we need for our clients. And so I had this idea that I could start a business and continue doing the work that I had been doing as a researcher, but for lobbyists instead of legislators. Thought it was marvelous. I had been in so many committee hearings watching lobbyists testify badly because they had not done their homework and they didn't have their background. My job was to help the legislator with the background, so the legislator made the lobbyist look stupid. I could help that lobbyist be better prepared to testify to the legislature. That was my thought. And these two lobbyists said, you know, we'll help you, we'll share some clients, we'll find some clients for you. I said, great. So I ran off to Paris for a few weeks and started feeling guilty right before I left and told my boss that when I get back, I'll be resigning at the end of the year. I'm using up my vacation, and then I'm going to leave. So I started my own business and discovered lobbyists really don't want that kind of background information. They are not interested in that.
Really?
If they need it, they can ask a legislator to ask somebody at LCB. So they don't need to pay somebody to do what I was doing at LCB. And so in order to be self-employed, I did have clients that hired me to do research and to do background work, but I also had clients who hired me to lobby. And one of my first clients was a company that was building a mine outside of Midas. And it was the first underground gold mine in Nevada in many years. And they hired me to be their lobbyist during the 99 session. So 1999, I came back to the legislature as a lobbyist. And I had my own business until, in 2001, I decided to move to Las Vegas because that's where the action is. That's where everything's going on. That's where all the people are. I had friends there. It was a good idea. I loved living in Las Vegas. So I moved there in 2001. And then in 2004, I went to work for R&R Partners in their government affairs area. And while I was at R&R, one of my clients was the Nevada Mining Association. And I worked for R&R until 2006. But, you know, I'd gone from having my own business for 6 years to working for a boss, and that made me kind of itchy. I wasn't very good at it, didn't really like having a boss. I liked being my own boss. So I was at a conference at Arizona State, and I had some time to kill between sessions. And I wandered over to the history department and I met the chair and I said, you know, I'm thinking that when I retire, I might want to go back to school and get a PhD in history. And he said, well, why would you wait that long? I'm like, well, I kind of have to have a job. And he said, well, let's see if we can find you a stipend. And I got back to Las Vegas and talked to some friends and they said, you know, you should do this. I wasn't married anymore. There wasn't really anybody that I needed to stay in Las Vegas for. I mean, shoot, my dog and cat had just died. So I thought, well, I'll put the house on the market and I'll go back to school. So fall of 2006, I left R&R, put my house up for sale, moved to Phoenix to go to school, and then the economy started to soften. My house was not selling as fast as I thought, as things that had happened before that, so I changed realtors quickly. And he got that house sold in January of 2007, and the economy crashed.
You were really fortunate.
Oh my gosh. I used to joke I was the last person to sell a house in Las Vegas. I was so fortunate. And I was at school. I tell everyone, the best midlife crisis ever, quit your job, sell your house, go back to school. I had so much fun. It was hard, it made my head hurt. It's hard to go back to school. And especially things had changed. The university system that I had known in the early 80s, especially history education, was nothing like I was seeing in the early 2000s. That 20 years made a big difference. But it was still fun. I had a great time.
And what did you do your dissertation on?
I focused my dissertation on the women who served in the Nevada legislature and their impact on tax policy development between before 1960. That was my cutoff.
So I have an observation, and I'm wondering if you did too. Right after suffrage, we're in the war, and the counties elected a lot of women, and lasted about through the end of World War II, and then all of a sudden the women are back in the House and the men are in the legislature, and it took quite a bit of time before they started coming back again in the 70s.
The first woman who was elected to the Nevada legislature was Sadie Hurst, who was elected in 1918 to serve in the 1919 session. Women had the right to vote in the 1916 election, but the only woman who ran did not win, so there wasn't one in 17. And you know, the Nevada legislature meets every odd-numbered year. So 1919 is the first woman who serves in the legislature. There was one woman elected in 21, and then there were 4 women elected for 23 and 25, and then the numbers start going down. 1931, that crucial session of 1931, there was no woman elected to the legislature. And we say crucial because looking back, we know that that was when gambling was finally legalized. They didn't apparently think it was all that big a deal, but that's a tangent. So no woman in 31, no woman in, I have to remember this, 30, 33 and 37. There were just 3 sessions. There's only been 3 sessions with no women after Sadie Hurst was elected. And for years, for decades, only one woman was elected each year. But as we get closer to the 60s, then, and especially as population is growing in Southern Nevada, then we see more women elected to the legislature. What interested me about those women who served before 1960 was, you know, who were they, one, and 2, where did they have an impact? You know, you think, oh, it's only 1 woman or 2 women, they must not have had any impact. But the Nevada legislature is so small that it is very difficult to marginalize people. That's, at least historically, that's how Nevada has been able to compromise on issues, because the legislature has got to find a way to include most everybody. And so I didn't think these women were marginalized. And I also didn't think that they were only interested in maternal issues. I mean, even women's historians have been guilty of this, of saying that in public policy, women were only interested in other women and the family. So I was curious about that, because Nevada had major tax shifts between 2019 and 1960. Where were the women in those? And not only tax shifts, but also divorce. Divorce became easier. Gambling was legalized. All these things that conventional wisdom told us that women would have been opposed to. Well, here are these women who were in the legislature. What did they do? They were right in the middle of it. They weren't opposing divorce or gambling. The gambling bill originally passed, 1931, 1927 was the first time it passed out of the assembly, and it passed out of a committee that was chaired by a woman. So this sense that just because a legislator is female, that she's going to be opposed to some of these things, that's what I was curious about and wanted to explore in my dissertation. And what I found was that regardless of party, regardless of geography, these women would talk about maternal things, but they identified as businesswomen who represented the economy of their state, and they were involved in those conversations from the very beginning. And the sales tax itself is a, women have been advocating for it for years because it was going to be used to fund schools, and schools were badly funded. Seems to be a theme in Nevada history. But in 1953, when that legislation finally passed to create a sales tax, Maud Fraser was part of that, Hazel Denton was part of that. And after the session ended, there was a group that had been organized in Las Vegas to run a referendum to reverse the sales tax. And a bunch of women met and said, we can't let that happen. And so they ran their own referendum to save the sales tax, essentially. And at that time, 1953, so this was 54 when it was voted on, once the voters came down on one side or the other, and again, like the abortion ballot question in 1990, that was it. Legislature couldn't change it. So we have, during the legislative session, a group of women lobbyists and women legislators who are advocating for the imposition of the sales tax. And then in 1953-54, women ran the campaign to enshrine the sales tax in state law. And that's why the state sales tax is 2%. It has been 2% since 1953. It cannot be changed, up or down, sideways. That's why we have the local government services tax and these other taxes. But the state sales tax is 2% because the lobbying group known as the Little Mothers got it passed in 1953, and the women of Las Vegas and Reno ran a referendum to ensure that nobody could mess with it ever again. That stuff's fun. I got a little sidetracked there on my dissertation. I was in Phoenix taking classes fall of 2006 into spring of 2007. Summer of 2007, I was in Midas. My parents were spending their summers in Midas, and so I got out of the Phoenix heat and would stay with them in Midas for a while. And I met a man in the Midas bar who was kind of cute. Cut to the chase, we are now married, but we met that summer in the Midas bar and started dating. He lived in Battle Mountain and I lived in Phoenix. That's not very convenient. And he too decided that he wanted to go back to school. And he was, turns out the best school for what he wanted to study, which was physical therapy, was in Phoenix. Like, this is perfect. So he quit his job, sold his house, moved to Phoenix, moved in with me, that poor man. He went from 10 acres in Battle Mountain to an 8th floor condo in central Phoenix. And he still speaks to me about it. But when he got there and he started the program, he discovered that actually he was on a waiting list. So he came home from school one day, and it was in the fall, and he said, I'm on this 2-year waiting list, and I can take classes online and work toward another degree through NAU, or we can try to find another program somewhere. We checked Las Vegas. They also had waiting lists. And at that point, I'd finished my exams. I was getting ready to write my dissertation. He's going to be taking online classes. I'm writing my dissertation. Let's move to Midas. So we did. So we moved to Midas. Really fantastic internet service out in Midas still. And we lived there 2010. So in the fall of 2010, Brian Sandoval was elected governor. And Dale Urquiaga was one of the, sort of a split chief of staff situation. And Dale has been probably my best friend for 30 years or more. And Dale said, we want you to come work for the governor's office. I said, well, I'm writing a dissertation and I don't want to give that up and I don't want to leave Midas. And so we worked out a deal where I worked half-time for Governor Sandoval as his researcher. And I had worked for him when he was an assemblyman, so we knew each other. And I would do 1 week on, 1 week off. So I could be in Carson City 1 week and then Midas the next week. Get my dissertation finished so I can graduate in May, which I did. And then Shannon and I got married in July. And then it was time for him to go back to Arizona to go back into the in-person part of his program. And the job at the governor's office was supposed to be temporary. It wasn't supposed to be full-time. So I said, temporary is temporary. I'm done. We're going to go back to Arizona. Then I think it was Dale who called me, but it might have been Heidi Gansert. I can't remember which one. They needed a regional director for the governor's office of economic development, and I had worked on that bill during the 2011 session. And so they asked me to meet with Steve Hill to see if I would be willing to work with Steve and work at that agency. And I'm like, yeah, I want to go to Arizona. I don't know that I want to work full time. Let's see. So I met Steve for coffee. And Steve Hill is probably one of the most charismatic people I have ever met. And by the time I left, I'm like, hell yeah, I'm going to go work for GoEd, and this is going to be great. We're going to have a lot of fun, all these cool things to do. So the plan was that I would work for GoEd, and then when Shannon had to be full-time in Phoenix, we would commute again back and forth. And we did that for a very short period of time. This is not why I got married, to do a commuter marriage. So I left GoEd, went to Arizona with Shannon. See if I can follow the date. So 2012. So then I started doing contract work. And one of my contracts was with the Lander County Historical Society to write History of Battle Mountain, which was one of the most fun projects I have ever worked on. It was so much fun. But I don't recommend writing a book in a year. That is, from a blank piece of paper to a published book, was tough. So I did that. I also worked with the State Sesquicentennial Commission. So kept my hands in Nevada. And when Shannon graduated in 2014, he said, I know you can work anywhere you want in Nevada, and so can I. So why don't you just pick where you want to go, and that's where we'll go. And my first thought was Las Vegas. Definitely we're going back to Las Vegas. And I went to visit some friends, and I thought, Shannon's going to hate this. This is not his place. So we moved to Reno. He went to work as a physical therapist assistant. He went from being an underground mine surveyor to being a physical therapist assistant. Worked at a couple of facilities here in Reno that he really liked, and I thought I would just do lobbying. I was with the firm that had Tesla during the special session, and thought I would just get back into that. And then the opportunity with the Mining Association opened up. So at the end of 2014, must have been like October, I was asked to apply to be president of the Nevada Mining Association based on my experience with the legislature, my policy experience with natural resources and mining, and my long engagement with Nevada history, because mining is very much a part of the state's history. So I applied for that job, went through the interview process, and became the first woman president of the Nevada Mining Association in December of 2014. I didn't intend to apply for the job. I was very familiar with the Nevada Mining Association. I had worked with, way back when I was a legislative researcher and working for the Public Lands Committee, I vividly remember calling the Mining Association president to ask him to come testify to committees, and he would ignore me. The guy never returned my phone calls. I was very happy when he left. And they hired Russ Fields, who was a delightful man, and Russ and I worked together very well for many years. And so I was very familiar with the Mining Association. The job was open because Tim Crowley had left. He had decided to go do something else. And Tim and I, although Tim is younger than I am, our careers have had these strange intersections. Not strange, but we've just intersected at different times in our careers. And so I knew Tim had left, and I was asked by some folks in the industry if I would apply for the job, and I said no. And they're like, well, why? It's a good job. Why wouldn't you apply for this job? I said, well, why does anybody want to get beat up? Tim had gotten beat up a lot in the press. And why would anybody want to do that? And so I was asked twice to apply, and I said no both times. So Tim got a hold of me, and we went out for drinks, and he said, "Don't be an idiot, apply for the job," and started telling me the other things that the job does. And he was absolutely right. We've talked about this since then. The public sees the mining association president who goes to the legislature, but there is so much more involved in this job in terms of educating people about mining. I mean, for those of us who grew up in Nevada of a certain age, mining was just part of the state, but for most Nevadans, they're not familiar with the modern industry. They just see the grizzled old miner with a burro and a pan and have no idea how things have changed. And when I started to realize the opportunities that came with this job, I thought, well, okay, if folks think I should apply and people I respect think I should apply, why not? I'll apply. We'll see what happens. And but I knew that the job, the job had been held by men since it was created in 1913, and it is still a very male industry. It is very much a male-dominated industry. But I'd worked in male-dominated industries my whole life, so this was just another one. And it had its challenges, and I was exhausted when I retired, and when I announced my retirement in 2019, I was truly exhausted.
And you'd worked how long?
I started in 2014, and when I left early in 2020, so it was close to 6 years.
Did you get any pushback from the males in your job, or had time changed a little bit?
Times have changed a lot. Yeah, times have changed an awful lot. And I was asked by several board members not to leave when I left. But like I said, I was exhausted. And Shannon and I had the opportunity to buy my parents' house in Midas. And we got to, we looked at our opportunities. We looked at this house. We looked at where we were financially and decided, let's retire. Let's just go to Midas. This is where we want to be. So March of 2020, we literally were driving out of town the day the governor shut everything down. And a very surreal experience. We were super fortunate to be in Midas during the pandemic. It was a different experience, I think, than most other people had.
What do you think the most important thing you have done in your series of careers?
It's hard to pick out just one thing, but I love that I've been able to put a spotlight on Nevada women in all of their various roles in history and the contributions that they've made to the state. One of the really fun things to do as the Mining Association president was to start looking for women in mining history and then finding the vibrancy of that aspect of our state's history. I like bringing those stories forward. That's been a lot of fun.
And that kind of follows along my next question as, do you think you've done it all, or what are goals left for you to accomplish? You're still a young woman.
I appreciate that. Thank you. No, I have not done it all. As a matter of fact, I have a whole bunch of unfinished things that need to be finished. And I could go off on a lot of tangents, but I'm very much involved in the history of Midas and that little town, and the people who lived there have such amazing stories. We're doing some really cool work on the cemetery. I am interested still in women's mining history and working with UNR Special Collections to set up a section on women in mining. There's so many fun things still to do.
And you were working with Elko County Museum?
Oh, that's right. The Northeastern Nevada Historical Society Quarterly, I'm the story or editor, it's fun, but oh my gosh, it takes a lot of time. I'm way behind right now. I've got one article that we're finishing on baseball in Northeastern Nevada. The next article will be on a series of biographies on African American miners, and you're going to be writing, you have already written about Maggie Johnson. I just need to get the thing published. So yeah, there's a lot of fun things to work on.
What advice would you have for, obviously we're Nevada Women's History Project, but just a young person from your perspective as they enter the workforce?
So, back to my dad telling me that I should major in something that would make me a bunch of money and I could do history on the side. I'm really glad I ignored him, and I think he would say that too, because studying history taught me how to think, taught me how to work through puzzles and complex issues, taught me how to write. And I know there's a lot of focus on going to school to get a piece of paper that will get you a job, but I think students should go to school to learn how to think and to learn how to analyze and to learn how to critique and then how to write about it. And the other piece of advice is just say yes. If somebody says, do you want to do this thing? Say yes.
Do you think a formal education is necessary for this?
For what I did, yes.
For someone just going out in a career?
I do have a bias. I think a university education is incredibly important, but it is not the only route to a good career. And and I'll put on my miner's hard hat. There are great career opportunities that do not require a university education, and that's just fine. And they should be celebrated in the same way. But a university education is still important.
What if I asked you, or not asked you, that you would like to add? Is there anything that I have not brought up that you feel especially passionate about?
I'm delighted that the Women's History Project is doing oral histories. During the break I mentioned Gwen and I worked on a great oral history project with the legislature, and such a fantastic project. It's a great way to capture people's stories, but in a few years, not that far down the road, somebody's going to be asking questions, and the answers to their questions are going to be in these interviews. And if you hadn't done the interviews, we wouldn't have them. So thank you for doing them.
Thank you very much for interviewing with us.
It was fun.